Invite Dr. Ayesha Gautam, Assistant Professor at University of Delhi, to chair this session and felicitate the presenters. So we have, okay, the books. Which book is it?
Okay, so welcome back to the last session of this conference. We have had, very thought-provoking, engaging sessions till now. And I'm hoping that the students will continue that in this session. So let's get started with the first presentation. By the way, you all will have 15 minutes for presentation and 10 minutes will be Q&A session, right? So let's get started with Sheetal's presentations. Sheetal is going to present on, her title is Embodied Space Against Pure Intuition, Extending Merleau-Ponty's Critique of Kant. Over to you, Sheetal.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Am I audible to all? It's okay, it's fine. Oh, am I audible now?
Yes.
Great. My warm greetings to everyone. So first let me state that the paper that I'm presenting today is not a finished paper. In fact, it's in a very crude form. So I'm just testing the possibility of this idea of critiquing Kantian notion of space from the insights of Merleau-Ponty. Let me just begin with something very familiar. So how do we understand space commonsensically in everyday experience? Through terms like near, far, above, below, right, left, or spatial, in the sense that, with the shapes like angular, round, basically location, distance, measurement, extension. But Newton stated that, the defining or this question of what do you mean by space is not really a problem for the... Okay, do it. But the thing is, I have to, it's just the, oh, I'm really sorry for the end. So Newton stated that defining the problem of space, the definition of the space is not really a problem. Commonsensically, everybody understands what do we mean by space. So what's the problem of space? Delineating the nature of space, what is the nature of space? So now what the question arises whether space is an independently existing entity, something that's absolute, that exists in itself, or something that's dependent on objects or their properties, or it's a relation among objects. And the another question can be whether space is dependent or independent of the subject. Now this is the whole problem of the nature of space. Now where is Kant placed in this problem of space? So Kant, being a transcendental philosopher, asks this question, what are the conditions of the possibility of experience? And he says that all our outer intuitions are necessarily spatial. So the question is, what are the conditions of this space, of the possibility of this spatial experience? So before coming to Kant, what is Kant's position about space, I would like to talk about the two views that were dominant before Kant. One is substantivalism and the other is relationalism. Newton posits that space is an absolute independent entity, something like a container, as this hall is, where things can be placed, this chair, the table, the subjects in it, the podium, all these objects which can be placed into it. So space and time points are something that subsists in itself, devoid of the existence of objects or relations. But then comes Leibniz. He says that space and time cannot subsist in itself. For this, he invokes his two principles, principle of identity of indiscernible and principle of sufficient reason. He says that God would not have any sufficient reason to place a body at a point because space is homogeneous. And then he says that, space is nothing but order among the relations of objects. And this view is known as relationalism. Then comes Kant and refutes both of these views, and specifically targets the Leibnizian account and the empiricist account, which says that we can derive this idea of space from the experience itself. He says that any experience that you have is necessarily spatially ordered. For example, when I say the chair in this hall, so it already invokes a spatial framework, and hence the space has to be prior to experience to condition the spatial ordering of our experience. And hence now I can say, what's the Kantian idea of space? He says that space is an a priori form of intuition which structures all our outer sense or outer intuition. Now this is basically just a very crude reconstruction of Kant's argument to pinpoint my criticism of Kant, which is drawn from Merleau-Ponty's insights. So here the first two, which, here you can also say the all outer intuition. All outer intuition is necessarily spatially ordered, and any ordered intuition presupposes a structuring form, which is basically his argument in the metaphysical exposition, and hence it has to be a priori. The next argument are there, I've derived it from his transcendental exposition, where he invokes the necessity and universality in science and especially in geometry. Geometry yields these necessary and universal truths about space, like, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Parallel lines never meet. Or some of the angles of a triangle is 180 degree. And all these I'm talking in the context of Euclidean geometry, which, I'll also be criticizing later on the issues with this. And therefore we can say that, space must be an a priori form of intuition which lies in the subject rather than in the world. Right now I'll be, just after this I'll be highlighting the issues with the transcendental exposition, and then I'll be moving on to the metaphysical exposition arguments through, Merleau-Ponty's idea, where he says that form and matter of objects are not really distinct, but something, that form being something that emerges out of matter. Here moving on to the issues in the transcendental exposition, where I'm arguing that Kant overstates the necessity and universality in science. So Kant's argument assumes science exhibits, let's just focus on this qualifier, the strict necessity and universality in absolute sense. However, as argued by a philosopher of science, somebody like Nancy Cartwright in a paper, Truth Doesn't Explain Much, says that scientific laws are not necessarily universal or necessarily true, and says that these are rather idealization, context dependent, and often revisable. For example, as we all know that, Newtonian physics breaks down at relativistic and quantum scales. This suggests that science does not depend on the absolute necessity and universality, rather stability, predictability, and coherence for its explanatory powers of the phenomena. Therefore, we can say that Kant's inference from science to a priori necessity is overstated. Moving on to the more stronger argument for the space, which he gives regarding the geometry. Here I would argue that geometry does not ground intuition. Kant assumes that geometry reflects the structure of spatial intuition. Just to give you a very crude analogy, it's almost like, the structure of space is how the structure out Euclidean geometry defines space in terms of, it's more like a grid that's there. And that in that, the structuring of this outer intuition happens. However, we have seen that, the contemporary developments of non-Euclidean geometry shows that multiple consistent geometrical systems are possible. And we can say that in geometry is something that's formal and constructed system, that's theorized, and now we have different multiple geometrical systems which are equally possible and logical. And in the modern physics, we have seen that, geometry is something geometrical models are something that gets its verifiability from the empirical theory. How we have seen, the curved space-time model being used in the theory of relativity, when Einstein propounded that, we have this space-time continuum, which is, space is not absolute, but something that's relative. And geometry is thus a formal and constructed system, not a direct expression of intuition itself. Therefore, geometry cannot serve as an evidence for the a priori nature of space. Now moving on to the implications of the issues with this transcendental exposition arguments. Once the necessity of science and intuitive grounding of geometry are questioned, Kant's central argument weakens because he relies heavily on his transcendental exposition argument. Though, there's the metaphysical exposition arguments are also there, which I'd be, discussing further on directly with the Merleau-Ponty's ideas. However, we can say that I would try to retain this idea that this does not eliminate the need for structure in experience. I'm not saying that the experience or the intuitions are something that are not structured, but the idea would be a different, of the structuring itself. How do I account for that? But I'm simply saying that, but it removes the need for a fixed and a priori structure that's something rigid, fixed, and imposed by the mind. And instead I would say that, we can consider weaker alternative where spatial structure just simply be stable and coherent, but not strictly necessary or universal. And hence this opens the way or a possibility of a different account of space, where we really look into the actual experience of space, basically the phenomena. And the methodology that I assume is the most faithful to phenomena is phenomenology. And hence, accounting for space requires attending to this phenomenologically. And now moving on to Maurice Merleau-Ponty's account. So let me just first state that what is space for him. Merleau-Ponty argues that space is something that emerges out of embodied engagements with the world. So the form is basically emergent, which emerges out of relations. And the relations are of not just simply mental relations, but basically the embodied relations, embodied engagements with the world. And hence he argues that there is no strict separation between form and matter of objects. We cannot really make this clear distinction between form and matter as, matter being something, you have intuitions of, and then form is something that's there in the mind, or mind imposes it to structure these intuitions. He argues that he borrows this idea from Gestalt psychology, where he says that space is a gestalt. So now the question arises, what is a gestalt? It's an organized whole arising out of relations. So basically it's a system, and in system there are different parts. And he says that those parts are not completely separable, but merely you can do functional distinction between them. And out of these relations, a meaningful whole arises, and that whole is not completely reducible to the parts. You cannot arise or you cannot understand the meaning of that whole simply by understanding different parts and then reducing them. So it's something more than the matter, but essentially also immanent in those parts or matter. So spatial organization is not imposed in advance, how Kant says, but develops through perception, movement, and evolves by increased integration and interaction. So here what do I specifically mean by this increased integration and interaction? So there is this system of intercorporeal engagement where things are in interaction or in relation with each other. As there is a increase in the complexity of these relations or increased integration of different parts, a form emerges, and that is dynamically constituted. This form is something that's continuously constituted. Hence we can say that space is dynamic, relational, and continuously constituted. Now moving on to this idea, since we have talked about how space is an emergent form. So the idea is what's our point of access to these spatial structures or these spatial disclosures? So for here, Ponty says that it's not the mind, but the lived body. Space is disclosed through the lived body. And here I would like to make a distinction between the lived body and the physical body, which we see as the body as object. Lived body is something that's a subject of experience, and which is also the 0 point of orientation and directionality. So the spatial structure is something where body is at its center, and we understand all these spatial orientations and directionality only in relation to this lived body. For example, near or far is something that's in relation to my body, or right or left is in relation to my body. Or, things like accessible or reachability. We understand all these these spatial terms only in relation to our lived body. And then he gives on to these two ideas of body schema and motor intentionality. So basically what are they? Body schema is something which is a pre-reflective understanding of our own spatial awareness and spatial organization. And motor intentionality is something where he says that we are always pre-reflectively, without any conscious thought, directed towards an action. And then how does this help us to build a spatial understanding or spatial intelligibility? For example, let's say Gautam, when he's when the cup that's placed in front of him, when he feels thirsty or want to have this water, he would not calculate the distance or measurement. It would pre-reflectively happen without any conscious thought, that he can simply grasp this cup and sip the water out of it. So there, this body schema or the motor intentionality, it's embedded in the body, this spatial understanding. And hence spatial structures are something that arises through what the body can do, basically the bodily capacities of the lived body, and not from a pre-given mental framework, what Kant argues for. And now, I would like to give you a few examples or a few experiments, empirical experiments, to really substantiate my arguments, that the ideas that I've talked in the previous slide. So there's this first case, a Schneider case, where a patient suffered a brain injury, which was very localized. So after that brain injury, the person was successfully able to do all the, successfully able to perform all cognitive functions. But, one interesting thing happened. When the patient was asked to perform concrete spatial actions, let's say when he was asked to move this mouse or, use this keyboard, he was able to do that. But when he was asked to perform abstract spatial actions, for example, pointing above his head or pointing towards a particular direction, he was not able to perform those actions, which highlights that there has been a break in the spatial understanding. And how we understand it through Kant's framework, that if it's rigid, it's fixed, then how do we account for this break in spatial understanding? Okay, somebody might say that, because of that injury, there must have been a problem with the applicability of that form. Empirically, somebody can say that. But the idea is the person is able to perform concrete spatial movements and not just the abstract spatial movements. So the problem here is not simply of the applicability, but the break in the framework itself, which Merleau-Ponty's account, Merleau-Ponty can account for, because he argues that spatial understanding depends on the embodied capacities. And basically when a system is there and there's some problem in one of the parts of the system, the whole form disorganizes, or there is I won't call it reorganization, because definitely some disorientation is happening there, but it changes, the form changes in some ways because of the change in one of the parts. The next experiment is tilted vision experiments. There were a few subjects and they were asked to wear these goggles which inverted or tilted their vision. So initially how it would, we would normally assume would happen with the subjects is they felt a bit disoriented. But the interesting idea is over time, they adapted with this inverted or tilted vision. So there was, we could see this adaptability. Okay, let me, I'm just taking a look at this slide. I got a bit disoriented, I'm sorry. Yeah. So subjects initially experienced disorientation, but over time perception reorganized and stabilized. And they were successfully able to move and perform concrete and abstract spatial actions. And hence here what we can see that spatial structures as something that are adaptable, reorganizable, and dependent on bodily interactions. How over time body interacted with the world out there, the form itself evolved, and the reorientation happened basically. So we can say that if space were fixed a priori form, such reorganization should not be possible. And which goes against the Kantian framework. Now somebody might say that if space is something that depends on body and it's perspectively given, how do you account for objectivity? And just to specify here, because earlier I've already talked about that in science there's no absolute universality and necessity even in geometry and all these natural sciences. So objectivity here I specifically mean by this idea of shared, coherent, structured public world where you are able to understand my spatial orientation, or we can experience this common world. There's a convergence of perspectives, spatial perspectives. So Ponty here gives, I'll just highlight these two ideas. One is, he says that all the subjects share similar embodiment structure and similar sensory motor capacities. And due to this common structure of experience, spatial relations are translatable across perspectives or get mutually intelligible. For example, when I would say this table in left of me, all of you people who are facing towards me would immediately understand that this table in left of you. Oh, okay, I'll just quickly get done with this. Just give me 2 minutes. It's translatable. And the second idea is basically, which is quite dense, and it appears in his work, The Visible and Invisible, which unfortunately he couldn't finish. So there's a shared field, which he says there is this intercorporeal field, the system that I've been talking about, which I did in the context of Gestalt. So there's the system, the field, in which there is this intercorporeal engagement. It underlies perception, it underlies all our perception, and which creates a possibility of convergence of perspective. And this field is something that's open-ended, basically how we experience. Right now, in my perception, what is present to me is basically one side, one angle, from a one perspective. But my perception, what Ponty argues, is not simply limited to this visible. It has an open horizon where also this invisible is included. So invisible in the sense the other dimensions of it. So the perception as a meaningful whole includes all these other invisible dimensions itself. And hence it creates this idea of openness, which creates a sense of infinity in that we see in the space. And hence this creates the possibility of convergence of perspectives. And hence we can say that this weak sense of objectivity arises from shared embodied structures and shared field. And also to just simply give you an illustration, towards the end of this slide, I've added this painting to give the idea of the system, how Merleau-Ponty sees the system is. So in this painting, you can make some functional distinctions, but you cannot really separate these entities. So he sees the system that way, that things are coherently interconnected. They are in relation, in engagement to each other. That there is no absolute distinction. One part is one element is in some way also the other, but not absolutely other. If I'm making some sense.
Sheetal, please conclude.
Yeah. Just to presentation, I would argue that Kant successfully shows that experience requires structure, but he overstates this by demanding strict necessity and universality. And his account does not align with the variabilities of lived experience that we saw through these empirical examples. And Merleau-Ponty's model of space seems more faithful to the phenomena, and which can also account for the stability, coherence, and a shared world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheetal, for that informative presentation. Let's get ahead with Rajan.
Thank you. I have a very sparse reading of Merleau-Ponty, and a lot of his critics, they emphasize on one particular point, and maybe you can shed light on whether they're being faithful or not, is that Merleau-Ponty, because his conception of anything, space included, is through embodied perceptions, something to do with the body. The body will, no matter how you conceive it, it will have parts. And these parts need to be held together. So for example, even in Leibniz, you have this concept of a dominant monad, right, that holds all the other monads together. And this can go all the way back to Aristotle, where he's arguing against the pre-Socratic materialists that they don't have a principle. You need a principle to... And when we see the body, your skin sheds, matter keeps on changing, right? Our cells sheds, we grow, we shrink. So matter keeps on getting at it. Do we not require a principle? But because Kant has this transcendental perception, but Merleau-Ponty does not. So
he does not really say that we need a principle to account for the coherence or these parts, because he says that this idea that how we understand these different parts in terms of the physical body. And here when he's talking about the lived body, he's not really accounting for the physical body, and that's how he says, because if we talk about physical body, then physical body has to be, it cannot be 0 point of orientation. It has to be something which is in space. So here lived body is something how you experience, or how you experience your body, and for that he invokes this idea of phantom limb in empirical psychology, that when for the few patients, what happened was when their leg got amputated, but they were still able to have this experience of the leg or the limb. And also he invokes this idea of how how different objects can also act as, more like not exactly identical, but an analogy of, how things, how different objects can act as an extended mind. So also explores this possibility of how different objects can be, a part of this lived body and can act as an extended body for the subject. If I make some sense.
I just wanted to say that there are still parts, even if it's not physical. There are still parts. There's left, right. How do they?
No, but those are not the parts of the body. They are the spatial structure. That's how the experience.
Okay, no cross questions, because we have a lot of. Okay. So Andrew is there, and then here we have 2 people. Then Professor Nakshi is there. Can we take the questions together, and would you want to answer, or would you want to go?
Maybe my attention span is not going to help me, and then I'll just simply forget the question.
Okay. Sure, if you want to, sure. Yep.
Professor, can you hear me? Can you hear me? You can go ahead with your question.
My turn?
Yeah.
Is it my turn?
Yes.
Yes, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the presentation. I have 2 quick questions. One is, shouldn't we be more attuned to the difference between transcendental philosophy in Kant's case and phenomenology in Merleau-Ponty's case, so that the relation is not one of competition and controversy, but of a radical shift of perspective, a totally different conception of experience than the fairly formal and, in the technical sense, transcendental one in Kant. So that would be the first question. And the second one is, what does the exploration of space imply for the parallel treatment of time, as we have it in Kant, but we don't have it in Merleau-Ponty? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So for the first question, I'm really sorry, I think I just forgot the first question, if you can. But let me first answer the second question, which I remember. So you said that, Kant accounts for this space and time as both a priori forms of intuition, and where he says that time as a form structures are in inner sense. But you say that this account is not really there in the Merleau-Ponty, but I would say maybe not explicitly, but implicitly has talked about space and especially, time, especially in his work, The Visible and Invisible, where he talks about the depth being the primitive dimension of experience. And when it comes to the horizontal depth, he talks about space, but when it comes to the vertical depth, he talks about time. So in the vertical depth, he says that when I'm having experience of something, or just simply say in my perception, so it's not just simply this moment that's out there from which this meaningful whole or the structured experience is coming. It's also the remembered past that's there, the present invoking my memories or the past events. So there's this vertical depth which is the primitive dimension, the dimension that we experience in the lived experience, basically. So there's this horizontal depth that we can account for the spatial aspect, and there's this vertical dimension of depth that we can account for the time aspect. If it got a bit clear. Okay.
Yeah, can we go?
No, but
Yeah,
Professor
sure.
had another question. So the first question, I'm really sorry, Professor, I forgot the first question that you asked.
It was about competition versus cooperation.
Oh, yeah, clearly. These are 2 completely different methodologies, the transcendental philosophy and then the phenomenology. But there are scholars that, who have talked about a possibility of embodied transcendentalism, if that makes sense. Scholars like Sean Gallagher. So they have also predicted this possibility of embodied transcendentality, where he says that, when Ponty talks about the embodiment, he is taking this situated bodily perspective and accounting for the conditions from this embodied perspective, or the embodied conditions.
Yeah, so actually my question follows right up on that, on Professor Züller's first question. Yeah. I just wanted to clarify, so if we go in the Merleau-Ponty direction that you're recommending, which I thought was really interesting, I mean, it's a really good paper, do we then give up on the necessity and universality of, say, geometry, such that we no longer have the argument for transcendental idealism that Kant wants? Is that part of your view, that we give up on the argument from geometry or on transcendental idealism in general?
No, I don't think, though I have argued against this strict necessity and universality in an absolute sense, but I would say we don't really need to do away with this strict necessity and universality idea at all, because when we talk about geometry, so there are these multiple geometrical models which are coherent in themselves, and they're formal, they have their own rules, and in those systems we can really account for the necessity, but that gets a strict necessity in a contextual sense, if that works.
Yeah, I just don't see how you get the same sort of argument for the
now I
ideality
see
of
problem with
space and
that,
time.
that you trying to save the strict necessity in a contextual setup.
Right. Anyway,
So maybe.
I was willing to continue with what Professor just said. Can I? Yeah. So in my view, why can't we say that in Kantian scheme, when we say space and time, they are a priori and transcendental without, so they seem like some abstract rule. And to my mind, they seem fitting for a computer's functioning. Whereas for human functioning, why can't align with what you said? I mean, the very idea of spatiality and temporality, okay, let's talk about spatiality, is inherent in our existence as embodied existence. So our body is extended in space. I mean, so this is primordial, that we are embodied creatures, and so we abstract out space as a priori transcendental condition. And as Professor said, that can the two be reconciled, or necessarily they have to be in competition? So I think if we follow Ponty, then Kantian idea needs to be replaced. They are in competition. They cannot be reconciled, I think.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I would agree to that, because Ponty says something like, what is immediately given to you is things are in relation, there's no separable elements that's there. But what you do is you reflect on this pre-reflective experience, you abstract yourself out of it, and then abstract all these entities out of it, and then you try to discern what's the relation between them. And then he says that because the meaning is a whole, meaning is in the whole, and when you reduce it to parts, you cannot then get to the meaning that was there in a primitive sense, in the reflective sense. So he says that all these problem of subject, object, and interaction arises when there's abstraction that's happening. And that's why he says that, I'll do this work of detailing the pre-reflective experience. He's like, though that also requires some reflection, you cannot really detail this description of pre-reflective experience. And then he says, to Husserl that, there's this impossibility, though we are trying to go for this phenomenological reduction, but there's this impossibility of reduction because we are, placed in this system. It's impossibility of bracketing ourselves completely out of this system. And yeah, but Professor, I don't know if there are scholars that have argued, there's some compatibility, as I mentioned, embodied transcendentalism by people like Sean Gallagher. So maybe, they have a very coherent account of how these things are, we can have a collaboration. Yeah, probably in a different context.
Can we take other questions, because there are a lot of questions. So Suresh, Muskan, Dr. Bhaumik, Professor Mitra, and there's somebody at the back. So Suresh, are you going?
Yeah. So I was basically thinking about, since you are saying that...
Brief, Please keep it brief.
Yeah, I'll try to. Yeah. So basically, it seems to me that Kant is not at all disregarding the role of one being embodied or one having a bodily existence and then doing the task of, recognizing things and all of those things, because I think it basically, on the contrary, it presupposes that one does have a healthy body and mind, and then after that, so it's a basic presupposition that one has a healthy body and mind, and only then does all of these things happen. But his task is, I think, not to go into the empirical details of what kind of body does one have, but to investigate the formal epistemological conditions of how can one know anything at all. So, and insofar as, I mean, the example that you cited, that one does not have a limb or whatever, but even in those cases, when any kind of epistemological action happens, it happens with the minimal conditions, minimal formal conditions that he delineates in the first critique. So it seems to me that it is slightly misguided to say that Kant is not accounting for this, because that might not be his subject matter, to deal with the empirical details of individual or particular cognitions in particular individuals. They might not have eyes or hands, but still, insofar as they are doing any cognitive task, they are operating with the formal condition that Kant says. So I think it's somewhat misses. So I mean, just how would you respond to that kind of criticism?
Yeah, I agree that this is a very good question, because these are two different methodologies and very two different conditions that these two different philosophers are looking for. But the idea is, when he comes up with these conditions, and then we say, okay, when it comes to the applicability of these conditions, we see certain variations, and where those things are dynamically constituted instead of being fixed, rigid. So then, how do you maintain the coherence or the consistency in the system of that Kant built for the possibility of experience? So that I'm saying, we see some breakages, there are these things that those conditions are not really able to account for. So that creates some possibility for looking into a different methodology. But yeah, clearly these are, if we say firsthand, these two philosophers are clearly operating in different realm with with different conditions, that with a different aim.
But both are talking about human cognition. So the confrontation has to be taken.
Dr. Bhaumik and Muskan, can you please go ahead with the question?
She doesn't.
I don't have.
Dr. Bhaumik, you have a question, and then there's somebody at the back,
This
right?
is just a very short question.
Yes,
Are you saying that there is one space which is what I experience, and the other thing that scientists deal with, that's a very different thing?
Yes, sir. Basically, that's also part of my PhD project, where I would say, which is more primitive? What's the relation between this geometric space, scientific space, with this lived space? So there I'll be, right now I don't have arguments, but I'll be building on this idea that how this lived space is more primitive, and these scientific and geometric space are more theorization and abstraction of the invariant structures that we find in our lived experience, and basically how the process is happening, that I'll be accounting for.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Thank you. I really like the presentation. This is personally very interesting to me, because I am also into spatiality. My question is one about the use of the phenomenological framework, because I approach space via a psychoanalytic one, and the very last slide of your presentation, it had a line saying that Merleau-Ponty's framework allows you to see the lived reality in a coherent, stable manner, and so on. And I just feel like that isn't really the case, and I think this comes from his over-reliance on Gestalt psychology. I don't understand Ponty very well, but I do understand Gestalt, and I won't get into theoretics. I'll just give one small example, and I want you to respond to that.
Can you please keep it brief? There's another question which we have.
So the example is from Levi-Strauss's structural anthropology. Over there, he talks about how there's an anthropologist who goes to an African Bororo tribe, and he tells them to make a map of their village. Now, there are two types of maps which are made, which are very different from the bird's eye point of view, which you would actually get of the geographical space. One map is all the houses are circled around one central house, and the others makes two spaces in the map. And this, I think, points to the fact, which is
I'm sorry, here I would want to ask, what do you mean by two spaces in the map?
There's the higher, the rich people, their houses are on one side in the village on the map, and the poorer people, they're on another side. So these two different type of people, when asked to make a map, in a village, many of them make two very different maps, and this points to it's not exactly livedness of space, but that it is psychically produced. There's no there's like an emphasis in your presentation on like the pre-conscious, so on. Pre-reflective, yeah. But there's unconscious stuff going on there as well, like tensions and so on, social tensions which play out in space. And just from a phenomenological point of view, I would like you to respond to the example that I've laid out.
See, when it comes to the psychoanalysis part, I'm not at all, basically, not just limited, but not at all read into that area. And my understanding comes only from the Gestalt psychology understanding that Ponty has, and he talks about in his work the structures of behavior. And then there he accounts how does, this form emerges out of the different interactions of parts. But yeah, if you ask about the phenomenology part, like how would you account for these different perspectives? There's those two people came up with in the map. Then definitely there's some intersubjective sedimentation over time. That the aspect of temporality would also might come into that factor, and there's this historicity that gets attached to it. Basically. I don't clearly remember, but yeah, Professor Arindam once, when I was discussing my idea of space with him, he talked about how this, the idea of spatiality and the measurement emerges, how not just from some abstract spatial framework, but the idea of these measurement tools emerged from the hand. So you started to measure distance by taking the body into account. So yeah, it's also a process that we take into account, how I talked about the invisible aspect in the perception. That's not there. So there's this depth and openness. Meaning arises also from the invisible aspects. Where you can account for the past meanings. In the temporality, I give the examples of the past events. So maybe through that.
Okay.
But yeah, I think I was very incoherent with this answer. Let me just be clear because of my zero understanding. But I just tried to come up with an answer. Let me just say that.
Professor Mitra, you had a question. Sabdashwa, quickly.
One is basically I want to know whether Merleau-Ponty ever uses the word embodiment in the exact French equivalent. I don't think there is an equivalent, but if there is, correct me. Does that word, was it being used, this exact word? Because for me, this is a coinage which is of very recent times. For him. And the second question is that you have connected Merleau-Ponty with Kant through you've connected his body with his transcendental aesthetic space. So for me, another possible connection could have been the absolutely unspatial part of Kant, not space-time, but noumena, because for space and body in a way for Merleau-Ponty is about limit. And for Kant, noumena is exactly that point where it's the limit. So that could have been also one point of convergence. So if you have anything, just a remark or a question.
No, if you can, just reframe the last few sentences that you.
I was asking that, would you be okay to the suggestion that possibly there is this another possibility of connecting Merleau-Ponty with Kant with regard to space, where we are not connecting the space of Kant with the space of Merleau-Ponty, but we are connecting the space of Merleau-Ponty with the noumena of Kant. Okay, that being noumena qua limit.
That is an interesting insight, but given the limitations of phenomenological methodology itself, that they bracket all these questions about the objective reality, how it's there in itself. So they simply attend to the phenomena that's immediately given to you. So I discount this possibility, but yeah, that's an interesting insight. Maybe you can devise a methodology and then come up with it.
That is where things emerge.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sheetal. I also had a question after the presentation. So let's get started with the next presentation. So the next presenter we have Sabdashwa Chakraborty. He's going to present on the topic Freedom in the Real, Kant with Lacan.
Can I sit down? Okay. Hello. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm very sorry for taking time at this hour. Nobody might be very energetic or enthusiastic, but I'll try to keep it as short as possible. I will not try to do a comparative analysis of Kant with Lacan, the French psychoanalytic thinker. What I will try to do is try to supplement one with the other, not supplement in the positive sense. I'll try to sort of problematize one with the other. Problematize Kant with Lacan more than the other way around. I'll divide it into a couple of, let's call them chapters. First is I'll like to open with a quote from very early Kant in New Euclidean. He writes, "Spontaneity is action which issues from an inner principle. When this spontaneity is determined in conformity with the representation of what is best, it is called freedom." This is how I am setting the stage, essentially. So very early Kant, I'll dive right into Kant first, because we are in a Kant conference. So in Kant, the way Kant deals with the question of freedom goes to a lot of conceptual stages. So very early on, he was more of a compatibilist of the Wolffian kind, Christian Wolff, and he was staunchly against the the libertine view of freedom that was propounded by Christian August Crucius and other people from the who had a more orthodox theological rendering of freedom. Kant would take the Wolffian position, which itself was a Leibnizian deterministic position, significantly, but leaving out the sort of quasi-theological remnants of Leibniz, such as the idea of monads and the idea of the harmony and so on. So overall, Kant's compatibilism initially was quite naturalistic, because he was very much influenced by Newton and other people, and anthropological as well. Then Rousseau becomes a very important figure for Kant in his conceptualization of freedom. Freedom for Rousseau is a condition not only of choice and moral agency, but also of judgment and our cognitive capacities. This is in Emile. And we are aware of this freedom through a specific kind of self-consciousness that accompanies our activities of choice and judgment. So similar commitments we find in Kant. In 1764-65, Remarks in the Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and Sublime, again in Dreams of a Spirit Seer, 1766, and so on. So in this phase, the Wolffian, the previously Wolffian sort of naturalist version of compatibilism kind of goes for a toss for non-naturalist compatibilism, which sort of now has found a newfound interest in the question of liberty, in the question of choice and moral agency, and so on. So what is needed is a capacity for unconditioned self-determination, for spontaneity in the absolute. So we now need a notion of spontaneity, which was initially in a fully determined natural system. One wouldn't usually accept any such notion of spontaneity or things happening by themselves, non-causally. But now Kant's bent was towards this. Then comes the silent decade, the 1760s, before the publication of the first critique. And by the time the critical period begins, Kant is convinced that both theoretical and practical reason require an appeal to at least the conception, if not the reality, of freedom in the transcendental sense. So this is kind of Kant's turning point. So he goes from being a hardline naturalist to a sort of a Rousseauian, spontaneity-focused, libertarian, to now this person who wants to base both practical and theoretical reason in some idea of freedom, transcendental freedom. But the doctrine of the first critique still remains quite pre-critical in the way we understand the word critical philosophy, because Kant, in the first critique, the way he deals with practical, motivation, practical philosophy, his vision is still resting on very notions such as very affect-based notions, happiness, virtue, and so on. He still hasn't developed the more tenable versions of moral motivation that he develops in his later works. After this, there is groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, where Kant, now he for the first time introduces the notion of autonomy, around which his discourse of freedom kind of pivots. So autonomy was introduced this late. So before this, his understanding of freedom again was not really what we today would call freedom. He didn't have a notion of autonomy there. What Kant was doing is he was attempting to deduce the moral law from the phenomenal given of the freedom of will, similar to how he deduces pure reason in the first critique. So he was trying to follow the similar methodology for both the critiques. If we could deduce reason and in the transcendental deduction and so on, he also tried to give a deduction of the moral law from non-moral precepts. And the way he did it was quite, because he started his argument with the notion of autonomy, autos, nomos, self-law, self-rule, self-legislation. But why? Because the moment we say legislation, even if it's being imparted upon and by the self, there is already an appeal sort of made to larger community, a universality. So that's how the universality maxim kind of creeps into the picture. And that's how we kind of go from, we start with the freedom axiom and we kind of deduce the moral law. This was groundwork, Kant's groundwork version of things. And then he again took a full somersault sort of in 3 years, which scholars have long debated. With the publication of the second critique of practical reason, Kant now either realized that the project of the project of the groundwork of deducing the moral law from non-moral premises is not tenable enough, is not doable enough, for multiple reasons, one of them being freedom itself is, as part of the third autonomy in the first critique, it's not something that you can begin with. It itself is a very problematic notion. It's a very baggage-ridden notion. So that much of importance cannot be given to freedom to base an argument upon. So he changed this argument. What many scholars, such as Karl Emmerich and others, they call this the Great Reversal thesis, where Kant goes from starting from freedom and deducing the moral law to starting from the moral law as a given. This is what is called the fact of reason, which we have discussed already. Yesterday presenters had spoken about this. Even today we had resource people talk about this topic. So now moral law is no longer up for inference, up for being proven. It is something that you start with. And he is using very phenomenological presuppositions to do this, because he's saying no matter what you do, you always feel moved to act. You feel like there is something, an impetus that you feel, a drive that you feel to act. So we need not deduce the moral law from anything non-moral. By the fact of being a human being, a thinking, a cognitive human being with all the faculties in place, you already are instituted within the order of the moral law. With the moral law, you kind of now build your further system. So you start with the moral law, then freedom itself is, freedom follows from the moral law. So now the order of proof kind of gets reversed. There is another camp of scholars, Allison being one of them, who believe in the transition, the shift, but they do not consider it a reversal or a retreat or a backtrack. They consider that the origin of the moral, the argument in the second critique was already there in some, in the form of a germ in the groundwork itself. So they see continuity in there. So that's the continuity camp of scholars. So overall, and the fact of reason, for example, Allison describes it as consciousness of the moral law as supremely authoritative, or equivalently, the consciousness of the categorical imperative. So the consciousness of the categorical imperative is the factum there enummed, the fact of reason. Now, let's come to what happens when the moral law is made an axiom for my system. What Kant does in the groundwork, in his first treatment, ma'am, where am I running on time? Okay, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 10 minutes. Okay. The axiom of moral law, if we begin with the moral law, then the groundwork version of the moral law founded on freedom already contains the grounds. That's what I believe, the grounds for deducing freedom back from the moral law. So essentially what I'm proposing is that you can deduce, not in an argumentative fashion necessarily, but through as a kind of philosophical exercise, for which I will be using the method of psychoanalysis, we can deduce freedom itself from the moral law by sticking to the groundwork version of things already. We need not come to the practical reason version, where we sort of axiomatize moral law, and so that itself becomes a foundation, unjustified foundation. So here, I think that is where the gambit of psychoanalysis is, of the Lacanian kind. This is where we'll begin. So this is where the Kantian account of freedom that I am broadly going to kind of now problematize in the way that Lacan, Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, reads Kant very thoroughly, one of the most ingenious and germane readers of Kant, who is again not very popular in so-called Kant circles, but because his method was extremely creative and very connected with life, that part of life which is not accounted for in philosophy proper. It's considered too below the belt. So psychoanalysis deals with, Freud's called psychoanalysis as that which deals with the refuse of philosophy, that which philosophy throws away. The leftover of philosophy, that is what psychoanalysis takes over. So now when we try to connect Lacan and Kant, we see that again, to go back to Kant, freedom is noumenal. Moral law and the self that this moral law describes is really noumenal, at least in the context of the second critique, because we cannot deduce it, but it's there in a way. But the experience of freedom, the way we experience it through empirical consciousness, the empirical apperceptive self and so on, not the transcendental, that experience is phenomenal. Now what I'm suggesting is that the phenomenal experience of freedom is essential for there to be freedom in the first place. So in a way, what I'm also suggesting in a covert, backdoor way is that the fact that the noumena exists as a closed-off space, as something that is not accessible, not knowable, is the very precondition for there to be an experience of freedom of will of the subject in the first place. If there was an access available, a window available to how things really are, it can take two different lines of argument. One, causality itself will be inscribed in the noumenal sphere, which is not allowed, so everything will become like an automaton, a pure mechanism, which will again not have a room for freedom. Or if that doesn't happen, then it is a completely disordered field, realm of events, eventualities that are happening sporadically here and there, all over the place. And again, there is no meaning construction going on, nothing to base your experience of freedom upon. So for freedom to be there, the noumenal separation, the noumenal, let's call it the cordoning of the noumenon, that has to be maintained. That separation, that leap cannot be made from this field to the other. Now, the reason Lacan is so much fond of Kant is for a very different reason. Because Lacan thinks that Kant is, what he's doing to ethics, I'll take 5 minutes. Okay. Yeah. What Kant is doing to ethics is essentially, he is challenging two very old preconceptions that the field of ethics was sort of living with, struggling with for thousands of years, right? From Aristotle to Bentham and others. One of them is the idea that the question of whether something is moral or not is contingent upon whether the outcome that the obligated outcome is possible or not. If it's a question of something that is not at all possible, then the question of morality doesn't even quite arise. So this is the ground on which teleological ethics and other variants of ethics are built. Lacan comes and Kant comes and not only questions, decimates this position. For Kant, it doesn't matter whether the outcome is possible. In fact, now this is where Lacan sort of takes it to its extreme. Lacan says the version of moral law that Kant sort of tries to propose, the thresholds of the law are so high that there is no law ever possible, no ethic ever possible that can be really maintainable authentically within the Kantian frame of reference. So in a way, either the Kantian moral categorical imperative is completely untenable, or, this is Lacan's suggestion, the Kantian ethic is not an ethic of the law, it is an ethic of the impossible. Now, impossible as a category, I cannot deal with this right now, but essentially impossible is that around which desire, and desire is again a concept in psychoanalysis, which has roots in philosophy, where there is a constant slippage of what you are seeking in an action, and that object, that desired object, keeps displacing in a semiotic fashion. And it's an impossible, the circle never closes upon itself. There is no possibility where an ethical law will really be fulfilled, or an ethical action can be really fulfilled. Let us take a very simple example, and let's say I'll end there. The classic example of thou shalt not kill, which is one of the 10 commandments, and sort of looks like a universalizable moral principle, sort of a categorical imperative. We know perfectly well that this maxim is like, if we know how the world works, practically speaking, we know never in the history of the world, and never in the upcoming history of the world in the future, will it be possible that this law will not be broken. It is not possible for life to go on the way it is if this moral law is universalized in this most literal form. Because the organization of the world, of life, of society, of the economy, of polity is such that this law has to be broken with new incorporated caveats from the back door here and there. So we know that this is, as a law, this is not tenable enough. But does that mean we leave this law behind? We kind of adopt a kind of fully relativistic position on, let's say, killing and crime? That's not possible. And the reason is, for Lacan, the law functions a dual role. The law is what gives direction. The law is what sort of structures you, binds you within a certain field of what is doable, what you should do, what you shouldn't. At the same time, the law also sort of subtly pushes you to transgress itself. So the law is both that transgresses, wants itself to be transgressed, and that which sort of also sets the field against which a transgression has to be mounted. This is where Kant's genius is. For the first time, Kant brings in a notion of law which is disinterested in personal matters. Although for Lacan, what Kant calls pathological desire and so on, these things, Lacan has a whole different reading of them, which I cannot go into. But overall, I would like to finish with just one quote from Zupancic. For Kant, he's discovering the real core of ethics, a core that maintains its relevance and cannot be reduced to the logic of the superego. But he criticizes Kant, Lacan criticizes Kant, for turning this core into object of the will. So where Kant differs from, Lacan differs from Kant is that he sort of is not okay with, again, Kant turning this moral law into something which is based on a certain liberal humanist notion of autonomy and will. So there again, he will bring in other notions of the divided subject, unconscious, and so on. So this is where I would like to rest my paper, like my case for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now we can take questions. Yes.
No, so I just want to first a very simple clarification. So you spoke about how in the groundwork he starts from the fact of freedom, right, and deduces the moral law, and then he makes the flip in the second critique. You said that he takes the moral law as axiom in the second critique, and you believe that freedom can be deduced from the fact that he starts from the moral law using the deduction he uses in the groundwork. That's what you said, right? So can you elaborate a bit more on that? Because are you envisioning the deduction just being reversed from the groundwork and being applied the same way? Or is it like a different part of Kant that you find? Or is this what you're supplementing with Lacan? The reverse deduction?
So I took a different methodology regarding this. The argument that I had was, but 1 minute, let me see if I... Yeah, so the way I am connecting, I'm drawing moral law itself, freedom itself from moral law in the context of the groundwork is by, again, smuggling in Lacan, in Kant. Because I am stating that when we begin with a law, let's say groundwork begins with freedom, it ends with the law. But even when you begin with a law, the law is what sort of gives you the horizon to be free. It is the law that gives you the horizon to be free. That's why in the state setting part I gave the quote from early Kant, where he's exactly saying something that is unthinkable in Kant. It's very Hegelian in a way. That spontaneity is action which issues from an inner principle. When this spontaneity is determined in conformity with the representation of what is best, it is called freedom. So spontaneity in conformity with representation of what is best. So this is freedom for Kant very early on. So I am kind of reading him via this route, and I am sort of very sneakily smuggling in Jacques Lacan into this conversation, if that helps.
Okay. So what the freedom in the real in Lacan would look like, maybe in structural terms, but if you can differentiate it from Kant, and also maybe a little bit of mapping, if you can do.
Yeah, so basically that is what I was going for in the long term, but it's because the thing is, if I go in that direction, then the Kantian picture I have to sacrifice. But the thing is, freedom in the real, so we know that Alenka Zupancic has a book called Ethics in the Real, where she exactly does the unthinkable. She brings Kant, what Lacan has already done, she rereads him and adds her own arguments. She brings Kant in conversation with not another great noble philosopher, but with somebody like Sade, Marquis de Sade, the libertine thinker. Because for Lacan, Kant has this famous essay and whole seminar on Kant and Sade, where for him, desire, that thing that Kant is always trying to disavow, is what is really at the base of why you want to have a moral law in the first place. I mean, the explanations, the justifications that it's for the betterment of the whole world, it doesn't answer that question. Why would you want to care of the betterment of the world? Either you then fall back into a kind of utilitarian position that I want the betterment of the world because in that case I myself will be better off, or you then are left with no grounds to say that. So this kind of interest of other, or though that argument doesn't work. The only argument that works in support of the moral law, the categorical imperative, is that there is something about the imperative which is itself enjoyable. It's not that it disavows enjoyment to some sort, or it sort of, but the law itself is enjoyable. The law itself is enjoyment. So this is possibly a way in which freedom in the symbolic order would look like. Freedom in the real, mediated through the law, in the real it would take the route of the drive, that which repeats endlessly. Now, when enjoying the law becomes, you take enjoying the law as a pure literality. It's no longer that following a certain habit gives you pleasure because of certain things. Your lifestyle is improved, you live in a better way, your things are getting done. No, that is still very symbolic in nature because other things are being associated with this framing of things. But freedom in the real, or law in the way it's connected to the real, is that if you are following a law for the sake of the very law, like there is something in the following through of the law itself, in the very literal grain of the letter, let's say in speech itself, the very act of speech itself is enjoyment. And for that, Lacan resorts to Joyce, for example, and other literary, Beckett, and all modernist writers, and a lot of other people. Yeah. So that is possibly a way in which freedom in the real looks like. So Samuel Beckett, or let's say James Joyce, is one of those, like Kant would use the word genius. Lacan doesn't like that so much. But are one of those personalities, those subjects who really had tasted freedom in the real, because they stopped using the moral law for any instrumental purpose. They didn't even want to use the moral law for any, great purpose, so-called ennobling purpose. But for them, the moral law was literally just that, a moral law which gives you enjoyment by following through, by, just following it to the T, to the letter. Yeah. I think that is a way in which freedom can be found in the real.
Okay, so next we can take Professor Mitra's question, and then Andrew is also there. So, yeah.
Oh, thanks, Sabdashwa. Very, very fascinating presentation. I just wanted to make a comment that Levinas himself also takes this kind of approach, that he says that the moral agent actually ushers in the moral commander and makes himself the object of the commanded. He himself makes the symbol. It is not that there is a moral law which is starting beyond any desire, totally undetermined, and freedom of the will. But here, there's a freedom is started in this way, that ushering the moral commander to be commanded. So making the commander. I mean, for example, we all know that the foot rule cannot really match with any one-dimensional length of the table, but that we make we desire the foot rule to make it a paradigm, and we enjoy the paradigm that, okay, it can be quantitatively matched. So I would like to, you don't have to answer the question, but you see that whether Lacan and Levinas, how they would differ. Yeah.
I think this is a very good point, because I think this is one of the points where the Kantian notion of autonomy can really work. Because autonomy is not so much in, the self-legislation thing, but autonomy is in deciding for your own sake to put yourself on the spot where the law applies to you. So I autonomously subjected myself to the law. I'm not saying that a person is free to, I'm not saying a person may not, there are situations, circumstances, and philosophy deals with such situations, Frankfurt cases in the determinism, free will debate, for example, where there is no choice. The thing has been decided on your behalf. But you still have a choice of, for example, voting in elections and these kind of things. You get an impression of choice, but maybe something has happened in a different way. This was used in American examples, for example. But I'm saying, even if you don't have the illusion of choice for you, the very fact that you have still sort of autonomously agreed to be subjected to this moral command, not decided to rebel against it, that already has very, I think, Sartrean and even Levinasian undertones. That assumption of that position on which that is requisite, that is essential for law to act on you. Because law can very well act on you if you do not want it. Regardless whether you want it to act or not, law will act. It will come and it will affect you. But there are, one version of things can be that you deliberately sort of self-ascribe it. So in that case, I think, like you said, the law applies to me only because I position myself in a way that the law applies to me. So yeah, I think that can be interesting.
Thanks. Really interesting. I don't know much about Lacan, but I'm curious about this idea that there's a workable moral psychology in which there's no version of ought implies can that holds. So it feels to me like there would be this huge threat of demoralization, and we'd end up in the kind of Albert Camus position where morality is just dropped upon us, but it's almost a kind of absurdity. We're like Sisyphus, we can never actually climb the mountain. So can you just say a little bit more about what it would be to agree that ought needn't imply can?
So the standard consensus is that ought implies can, but the thing is, even the can part is also an ought in itself. That which we are calling the can, the possibility, that itself is also an ought. But that is not the problem, I think. The problem is that the moral law even if these classical cases of Sisyphus or these thankless jobs, this Plato has this example of the, this cauldron of Denudis, the gods, the leak in the bottom, you keep pouring water and it keeps flowing out endlessly. So the thing is that had there not been a law to govern that, that displeasure also would not have emerged. So law both enables a pleasure to emerge, and law also enables that which is beyond the pleasure principle of Freud comes to mind, to emerge. So law is that which, as I said, my initial thesis, that law, the moral law, is that which wants you to follow it. At the same time, the moral law is that which also wants you to subvert it, to transgress it. Because that's how things evolve. If moral laws are really set in stone and monolithic, then the history of human beings on this planet, at least, wouldn't have been so beautiful and so dark as well, and so bright and so amazing and whatnot, I think.
I have one more question.
No. There's one online question I can't take. We have an on. Okay, so is he online? Yeah. Professor Zola, we can have your question. You can go ahead.
Thank you very much. My question is more general, and you might say in the sociology of knowledge of Kant studies today. There have been quite a number of papers at the conference that have the format Kant and X, and Merleau-Ponty and Lacan. And my question is, what's the cognitive interest, yield, gain, Mehrwert, so to speak, of such a pairing? And is it one for Kant, or is it one for the other author, or is it one for the one who entertains this comparison? So what is the general methodology and epistemology behind this double topic feature that is quite prominent here? Thank you.
Very interesting. I did try to address this in the beginning, that my methodology was certainly not comparative. It was not also fusion, post-fusion. Arindam Chakraborty has worked, himself has propounded this field of post-fusion methodology, for example. But when I think people in continental philosophy, post-war thinkers, etc., and so on, theoretical, when they deal with things, bringing two thinkers together, one of the logics is certainly not to create something good or something better out of both of them. That would be a very utilitarian reason. A very simply agreeable reason. That it's not so simple, I think. I think the reason is that it is supposed to lead to a very, very difficult battle between two thinkers, and in the process both have to have injuries, so that both find out what were their, what were their chinks in their armors. So I think. So that's why I said that I'm problematizing Kant with Lacan more here, although a lot can be said on how Lacan himself can be used to problematize Kant. The other way around. Kant problematizing Lacan. That I didn't do so much in this. But I think in this way we can the question is to create new avenues of possibility, because the horizon in which we live, possibilities, the truth tables that we have in front of us, the values are filled. And it seems they are the only possible options. Professor Sanil spoke beautifully about, contemporary movements in philosophy. So I think drawing upon some of those methodologies, the question is definitely to increase the scope of what it is considered, what is considered to be possible, so that the overall totality is reinstituted, not by simply incorporation of an exception, but by failing to incorporate an exception. It's something that you have to live with, and that's how the totality expands. It's not that the exception has been co-opted and brought to your side. So I think it expands the debate on both sides of the aisle, Lacan, Kant, both in their more Puritan kind of readings. But I think, this is a way in which we fight failure with failure to emerge with more failures, but like Samuel Beckett said, fail again, fail better. So I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zoller, and thank you Sabdashwa, in fact, your response about moral law was very Hegelian. I could see a lot of the... the last presenter for today is Gautam. Gautam is going to present on this topic, Hegel as a Kantian against the resolution of antinomies.
Sorry. So, Germinalism after Kant take a different direction where mistakes of the Kant had to be dealt with. Famously, Hegel's speculative dialectical logic is seen as the final step in resolving the antinomies that has struck the Kantian critical project. Kant is accused of positing a thing in itself, which is usually conflated with this idea of noumena. On the other side, Hegel is said to be transgressing the limits of thought discovered by Kant and totalizing the multiplicities of contraries into a system whereby everything alien is subsumable under the march of dialectical thought. Specifically, there is also a viewpoint among Hegelians that Hegel's science of logic was a purely presuppositionless and immanent movement of thought, as it is considered a purely immanent movement of thought from the subjective standpoint. I would say that this very viewpoint itself is both non-Hegelian and non-presuppositionless. The primary lesson of Hegel's science of logic is not that we can begin from a point which can be accessed outside our subjective symbolic structure. Even the beginning point of pure being, no matter how much non-dialectizable it is posited to be, is just a positation in Hegel. That which is lost forever, and yet it is reappropriated at the end point of the absolute idea. What I want to show is that in Hegel, and most importantly in his two of the most famous texts, Phenomenology of Spirit and Science of Logic, you will always find that every standpoint is a double standpoint. It's double not in the sense of a duality, but in the sense of division. In literature, the famous free indirect speech, the idea of free indirect speech captures this idea very well. If you read Joyce, Beckett, Kafka, Woolf, or Flaubert, more and less modernist writers, you will find the employment of free indirect style. It's a kind of impersonalization of character towards the direction of universal omniscience of the narrator and the implantment of the authorial omniscience onto the particularity of concrete character. In the structure of a novel, especially in the modernist ones, this division of subjectivity is structured very well. Hegel's phenomenology as well as science of logic is structured like a novel. It's a common presupposition that it is just phenomenology which is of a character of a Bildungsroman or a narrative-like structure. I would say that in some respects, science of logic is even more similar to the style of novel. Let's look at this sentence from Science of Logic. In no science is the need to begin with subject matter itself without preliminary reflections felt more strongly than in Science of Logic. In every other science, the subject matter and the scientific method are distinguished from each other. Also, the content does not make an absolute beginning, but is dependent on other concepts and is connected on all sides with other materials. These other sciences are therefore permitted to speak of their ground and its context and also of their method only as premises taken for granted, which as forms of definitions and such like presupposed as familiar and accepted are to be applied straightway, and also employ the usual kind of reasoning for the establishment of their general concepts and fundamental determinations. Logic, on the contrary, cannot presuppose any of these forms of reflection and laws of thinking, for these constitute part of its own content and have first to be established within the science. But not only the account of scientific method, but even the notion itself of the science as such belongs to its content, and in fact constitutes the final result. What logic is cannot be stated beforehand, rather does this knowledge of what it is first emerge as a final outcome and consummation of the whole exposition. Similarly, it is essentially within the science that the subject matter of logic, namely thinking, or more specifically comprehensive thinking, is considered. The notion of logic has its genesis in the course of exposition and cannot therefore be premised. End of quote. What Hegel is essentially saying here is not so much the commonly taken idea that thought has to renunciate its own presupposition first, and then it would find itself constructed in a developmental fashion. This would almost almost amounts to a blasphemy against the thought and an utterly non-Hegelian thesis, because it would amount to say that thought can jump out of itself to know its limits and encounter pure being as it is existing in itself. So the correct and more Hegelian way to read Science of Logic is not to read it as a text where speculative thought, after grounding itself first in phenomenology, comes to prove its own truth by putting itself under an absolute kind of doubt. We should rather think of the thought doubting itself as nothing but this doubt itself. When we do this, the commonly presumed distinction between phenomenology and science of logic starts blurring a bit. Both phenomenology and science of logic could then be seen as a thought's acknowledgement of its identity as a self-contradiction. Indeed, science of logic is nothing but the de facto exposition of thought as its own self-contradiction. Again, thought itself does not pre-exist its own self-undermining. As Hegel himself said that the initial immediacy is immediacy only in reflection and thus only as its own result, so the absolute itself is just its own result. Moreover, the initial immediacy which Hegel finds in the logic of being is nothing other than the final peak point of absolute idea. So the being which is non-dialectizable beginning is the very absolute idea itself, which is identifying with the immediacy of the being. As Hegel himself says, I am quoting him, "It is in this manner that each step of the advance in the process of further determination while getting away from the indeterminate beginning is also a getting back closer to it. Consequently, that what may at first appear to be different, the retrogressive grounding of the beginning and the progressive further determination of it, run into one another and are the same." This antagonism is also visible in Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, where he formulated with reference to an anecdote where a knight has a failed love encounter. Kierkegaard says, I'm quoting him, "Does he want to forget the whole thing? No, the knight does not contradict himself, and it is a contradiction to forget the whole of one's life content and still be the same. No inclination to become another, seeing nothing at all great in that prospect. Deeper natures never forget themselves and become something new. So the knight will remember everything, but the memory is precisely the pain, and yet in his infinite resignation he is reconciled with existence. The main point of Kierkegaard is to preserve the contradiction in the sense of an impossibility of there being any interface between, more or less, the first person engaged subject, which in Kierkegaard's case is Abraham, and the third person retrospective standpoint of the observer. What remains to be seen from a Hegelian point of view is just that there is nothing to be added to make the synthesis happen. The coming out of this irrepressible antagonism is just what Hegel explicitly identified with the absolute idea in his Science of Logic. In phenomenology also, we can see that each shape of consciousness is separated from the other by an unsurpassable, let's say it, nomina in the negative sense, a gap. It is only from the standpoint of the next shape of consciousness that the contradiction which was previously present is seen in resolution. And there also the contradiction is not resolved but resolved as sublated and thus purely maintained at the level of its own assertion as impossibility. Thus the shape of consciousness which comes later is also written in its own antagonism with itself. Thus, as Angelica Nuzzo has presented in her paper, that Hegel's logic is not presuppositionless in the common philosophical way. It is true that the immanent movement of thought from the beginning has always already been guided by the standpoint of the reflection. However, what we get here is exactly the beginning point itself. So the absolute beginning point speculatively coincides with the absolute idea. The limit or noumena coincides with the thing in itself. Thus even Kant has to take this Hegelian lesson that what he was searching for was always already there, and it has emerged only as Kant's failed attempt to cognize the complete reality. The limit of noumena is the point where necessity of our entangling ourselves with the contradiction comes from. Kant saw dialectic only as an illusion. Although he recognizes the necessity of it, he nevertheless failed acknowledging that the truth of the necessity of the illusion. Even the real sunset, as Professor Sanil has pointed out with respect to Zizek, even the real sunset has to look like a painting. And thus the reality itself has to look more like an illusion in order to be counted as reality. It is a general criticism as well as a misreading of Kant that he posited a category of noumena as an unknowable thing in itself, and Hegel corrected him by saying that the moment we posit a limit, it is always already crossed, and thus reason has surpassed the limit. My contention is that it's rather the opposite. It is Kant who posited the limit without taking this limit itself as a positive thing in itself. Moreover, it is Hegel who respected the antagonism and contradiction even more than Kant himself. Yet it was necessary for Kant to stop where he did to get stuck, because this was very thesis itself is possible only because he could be conceived from a later Hegelian standpoint. So Kant was not fully in the embrace of the very limit which he himself has discovered. That's why he stopped at the level of antinomies, which he posited as the oppositions. Only with Hegel did Kant's true thought reach at its very truth. So the distinction that Kant draws between noumena in the negative sense and noumena in the positive sense as a thing in itself should also be dismantled. Not only for Hegel but also for Kant, the noumena as thing in itself would coincide with the noumena as a limit. The subject is the one who pushed the noumena object outside the limit, as I think Professor Sanin has pointed out. Precisely in this sense, I want to say that noumena itself as the thing in itself is present always already as a crack within the phenomenal reality itself. So that was my presentation. And any question?
Thank you. Thank you for keeping it short. So yeah, now we can take the questions.
I'll just keep it short for that. I might just ask my first question.
We have time. You can ask.
No. I mean, after that I can come. But yeah. So the first question about the very beginning. So yeah. So you're saying that Hegel's logic is not presuppositionless, because it presupposes. It's not clear to me. It presupposes what? Because it seems to me that, of course, Hegel himself recognizes that there are many presuppositions to presuppositionless philosophy itself. So, of course, one is, of course, the whole phenomenological presupposition of the phenomenology. But also, apart from that, there are also other presuppositions which are not generally highlighted and are often misunderstood. In saying that, well, Hegel does not recognizes this presupposition, hence, he's just strong about his logic being presuppositionless. So other presuppositions include historical, cultural, even the fact that I have like tongues, ears, I am a historical being. All these are presuppositions. Without that, you cannot do philosophy. So in that sense, there are presuppositions to presuppositionless philosophy. What I think is the point when one says that Hegel's logic is presuppositionless is that there are no systematic principles which are involved at the beginning of the logic. So you cannot have any determinate systematic principle or rule or concept with which you can begin. So that is the whole point of the logic being presuppositionless. But so when you say that it has presuppositions, I just want to have a clarification. Do you mean to say that these presuppositions, then these presuppositions are well recognized by Hegel himself?
I know you're talking about historical presuppositions, cultural, bodily. These are not, like, that is there. I'm saying that even the very philosophical claim of science of logic itself, on a very structural level, if you say, is not outside presupposition. And that doesn't mean that Hegel has presupposed something. Like, even if Hegel hasn't presupposed anything, structurally, his project of science of logic is not presuppositionless, because there is, for example, let's say the standpoint of the absolute idea. In the absolute idea directly coincides with the beginning, but only after it has been reached. So I am saying that this installment of the very result at the final moment is true beginning than the beginning itself, than the beginning of pure being itself. So it's not a non-Hegelian thing to say that Hegel was presuppositionless. I think the more Hegelian way to read science of logic would be that even if Hegel was not presuppositionless, that doesn't do any harm to his project of science of logic, because he has, in a very beautifully dialectical way, has pointed out that the very structure of presupposition itself. So that was my point. Like, I'm not talking about historical, that is there. But even at a philosophical level, the way you, that's why I said that there is a constant to and fro in every step in Hegel between the first person point of view, or if you say the pure being, at the level of pure being, and the third person absolute idea. So Hegel is always between this unity of the division between these two. So Hegel has never taken any side of the absolute idea from where he can cognize about pure being, how pure being would have been. Even not Hegel as a thinker, but Hegel as a one who thought absolute idea. Even at the level of absolute idea itself, there is nothing there which radically dissociates itself it from the starting point. The division is there, but the division is their unity, I would say.
Yeah, but I think that. Yeah, no, but I think that is the whole point, right? Because, and I think a lot of harm is done to his claims. I mean, if one says that it's not presuppositional, because a lot hinges on that, and especially since we are in a Kant conference, and that is one of the fundamental points on which Hegel thinks that he is improving upon Kant. The deduction of categories in Kant is one of main targets, that he has not justified how he's deducing these categories, why are these only 12 in number, what is the relationship between, because he just takes it from the table of judgments. So I think a lot is at stake in saying whether Hegel is presuppositionless in a principled systematic manner or not. So that's one, but so coming to your point, as you're saying that no, he is systematically, he has some systematic, the beginning that comes.
Just 1 minute, just 1 minute. If we begin with this, even in introduction, Hegel is explicitly claiming that the absolute chance of presuppositionless thinking is when thought think itself. Logic thinking itself, thought thinking itself, or thought putting in doubt its own presupposition is the absolute standard. I am saying that the whole project of science of logic, that very doubt itself. So there is no establishing of any kind of structured developmental fashion, any categories in Hegel, other than this very doubt itself. So, in a very Saltatianist manner, just in a very sort of lightning way, the science of logic should be read in that way. I am saying that. It is true that you can say that the harm is done, but I don't think in Hegel we can always reconcile this very contradiction also.
But because that concerns the question of justification and necessity, because if he is just presupposing there is some presupposition smuggled in, then it's not that. Let me complete. I agree that of course at the end of the logic, what you reach is the ultimately is the beginning. At the end is the beginning. All of those things. But the fact is that what you are saying, I mean, that beginning which is reached at the end is a beginning with which we did not start. That's the point, because when the logic starts, we have not gone through the whole journey of the logic. That conception of being which we have at the end of the logic is a very rich, and structured being. Although it has that immediacy with which the being at the beginning had.
But do you draw this distinction between the rich beginning or the
yeah, certainly. It's because the beginning at the
I'm saying that
the beginning at the beginning. Okay, yeah. The beginning at the beginning is abstract, purely abstract being.
I'm saying that within the model of Hegel, can we imagine that this very distinction itself gets dismantled?
Yeah, but it's not there at the beginning. That's what I'm saying, na. That's why I cited Angelica Nuzzo's paper. She said that even at the level of beginning, the immanence of thought, the immanent development of thought was possible only because we had a reflective standpoint. Even if we reject this point, I'm saying that could you imagine a subject which for example, maybe a psychotic subject which hasn't been installed into a language? Could you imagine that subject to think beyond the level of language? That is not the point. That is not.
Suresh, can we have questions from others? We can have Sabdashwa's question and then we'll have
before the question, just to preface the question, I think that some philosophers wrote books which included the book itself within their philosophy. So their philosophy is not just the book. Their philosophy is literally the book itself. So it accounts for the world within which their philosophy is placed. Hegel is one of those philosophers. So the question of totality and the way Hegel sort of postulates his absolute spirit. I mean, the famous example from, I think, phenomenology makes it very clear. The spirit is a bone. I mean, the cynic will say, hearing all this, wishy-washy, absolute talk, that, okay, are you saying that everything is spirit? Is the spirit is a bone? Or is it a book? Is this the spirit? And then, of course, the cynic will respond to that. And no, of course, or let's say the adherent will respond to that by saying, no, of course, this is not all that the spirit is about. But Hegel is saying that through this very response itself, the spirit is establishing itself. So this is exactly what spirit is. It self-relates in a negative way to that which you ascribe upon it. I think that is one notion of spirit. So to come to the question, I think that granted that this is the self-relating negativity, the more you try to negate the position where you are coming from, the more you get entrenched back into that position. If this is my usual paradigm, this still kind of misses out on what Lacan, the phrase he used, not all, in his later work. So the logic of the not all has a different notion of how universality and exception relate to each other, where exception is not again and again sort of tied back, roped in again into the universal, but somewhere instead of being a exceptional universal, it is a non-universal exception, non being in a bracket. So it's a state of exception which itself sort of universalizes on different occasions, but as a whole it is not a universal again, because that urge to break and push off, inch further and further on, that is baked into the very this version of the non-universal itself. So you think the universal or the spirit of Hegel versus the non-spirit of somebody like Lacan, little Lacan, can be something that can problematize your thesis?
I think the second, if I'm not wrong, because I haven't read much of original Lacan, is the psychoanalytic position of femininity, maybe. And I would say, if we take Zizek, he would say that is a kind of fragmented absolute, where absolute stands against itself, a notion which is just by being what it is, stands against, vanished into its opposite. So I would say that it's a feminine kind of universality in context with Hegel. So, yeah. You see that in Hegel as well? Yeah. What I'm essentially saying is that what Suresh has asked, that when we reach the finality, I think that is the very point of the feminine kind of fragmented absolute. And in Hegel, there is always a tearing with the negative. So there is no point which is... of course, in the empirical sense, we can say that there is being, pure being, and now we have absolute idea. And despite considering all Hegelian consideration, we can say that they are not different. We are considering them in each other's context. I'm saying that even when you accept this point, there is still possibility of this fragmented kind of absolute, where we say that, as I said to Suresh, that the end point, which is the absolute idea, is a fragmented kind of absolute, the feminine universal. So yes, there is no duality. That's why Hegel is different from Kant, because the absolute standpoint is the standpoint of contradiction.
Okay, Raj, do you have a question?
So just a clarification, because you use this word coincide. We accept that this whatever movement of thought, it is in retrospect from a particular, some movement has already occurred and we are standing at a particular point. The owl of Minerva always takes off at night. You say that it is coincident. When you use the word coincides, it seems to me that now there are two things that are, coming together. Whereas for Hegel, this negativity that was there is all there is.
But that's
you cannot escape that point of view. There is no absolute philosophy that you can build. What he was, I think, also referring to. There is no absolute thing that can coincide with whatever we are doing. Whatever we have done with this reflection is all there is.
That's why I said that there is a duality in Hegel, but the duality there is an opposition in Hegel, but that opposition is not an opposition of duality, it's an opposition of difference. So the very difference between the first standpoint and the final standpoint is the absolute. The absolute is is its own negation. So it is more in emphasis is more on the side of negation than the absolute. So absolute is, if we can say this way, is more, it's directly identical with its negation. So the negation comes before the absolute, and absolute itself is only its own embodied negation. That's what I'm saying.
Are there more questions? Yeah, please. So that would be the last question.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So I found the idea very fascinating when you said that the phenomenology and the science of logic both are narratives. And you're thinking of them as narratives that are structuring the way in which they can come together, they can be thought of in relation. The question I have for you is, if I take a statement by Hegel like, the true is the whole, and then from there, I start thinking of these two different narratives, where at least for me, the way I understand the phenomenology is that it is where we begin from the subject, we begin from consciousness, and then we undo this duality or this division between subject-object, the idea, and we are able to reach absolute knowing. But on the other hand, when we start in the science of logic, we start with the object, this complete indeterminate immediacy. And then we are able to reach the absolute idea, which is where the subject-object division is overcome through the subjective notion of philosophy there. And so what I am interested in is, if you are able to see these two different narratives and also able to relate them in the way that you were trying to do, obviously you weren't doing it the way I did, but I'm saying you're able to see that relation. My question to you is, you ended with returning to Kant's noumena as a ground for this, that there is always a crack of the noumena that informs this. So what I'm trying to ask you is, how do you link back to the noumena if we have to hold what I am arguing is one of Hegel's very concrete maxims, that the true is the whole. I'd like to see this relation between noumena and not totality per se, but the very idea that there is truth in this wholeness. That's the question essentially. Thanks.
I think Hegel would say, as far as my reading is concerned, that truth is whole by including this noumena, by including this crack itself within the whole. So there is no whole in the positive substantial sense. The whole is this crack is the whole. So yes, the absolute is, as I'm again saying, that absolute is the fragmented absolute. So yes.
Done? Okay. So that brings us to the end of our presentations. I thank all the speakers for their excellent, presentations, and all of you for your active participation, questions, and insightful remarks. So thank you.